So it's day one in our summer series. We've been talking back and forth on how to kind of navigate our way through what is a very slow couple of, almost a month and a half maybe of football news. So today, for the summer series, we're going to break down position groups for the rest of June, and then probably we'll do some. We'll look at the rest of the NFC East once July gets here. So today we'll start with the defensive line. You know the fellas, we do it every Monday, so there's no need for introductions. Let's get right into it. The big news, we've seen this. I guess that Washington will take off, will listen to offers on Chase Young. It feels like it would have to be some kind of ridiculous offer for the Commanders to move Young. They need him to be successful this year. They need a good year. George, what would it take? What would the offer for you be for Chase Young?
It has to be a large package, man. So I think with Chase Young, the biggest appeal for him is that he's only 23 years old, right? Obviously, he's had his injury history, and we're kind of concerned about his production. You know, he hasn't produced in about a year and a half now, but the fact that he is that pedigree guy from Ohio State, that he has a physical attributes, that he's large, that he has, he has the ability to take over a game, you can't just let that walk out the door. We'll talk about this as well. Like the 5th-year option, I like what they're doing and kind of incentivizing him and kind of trying to burn a little, get some fire underneath him to get him going. But that is kind of a risky business because we are going to be looking at Montez Sweat next year. In regard to answer your question, it has to be at least a first-round pick plus some. Because I think when you get this, when the number 2 overall selection, he's going to be someone that you build around. I understand he's a 1-year rental, so his actual rate is kind of low on the market right now. But in regard from the Commanders, he's more valuable to the Commanders than anybody else right now. We need to kind of put him on our team and see how he can produce. And the whole point of the first round selection is that you want to pick high upside prospects, right? And to me, Chase Young is one of the highest ones you can get. We have to kind of see where he is, kind of walk that through before we let him go. So at least a first round selection plus some, and maybe a second rounder as well. And that's just me having a high price tag. I don't know if you guys agree with that or disagree with that.
I think they'd be lucky if they got a second round pick for
Chase
Young.
I know.
And the crazy thing, George, I think if I'm the GM, if I'm the head coach of the Commanders, there's almost virtually no package I'm willing to take because I need them to be really good.
Exactly.
If I'm the GM of the Commanders, I'm thinking long and hard about taking the second round pick and just, hoping that we get the same kind of production from the ends that we got last year when he wasn't here. Adam, walk us back. This was the second overall pick 4 years ago. What went wrong here?
I think we have to remember prior to the injury too, he really wasn't having a great impact on a lot of games, and a lot of people were questioning if his head was there, if he's just going off script. And from everything I'm hearing, that's the problem. He's not within the system too much. I think he tries to freelance. And the consistent thing I keep hearing is this stutter step that he keeps doing. It's just labored, and it's delaying him really getting to the quarterback. And I think what they keep saying is they're trying to coach that out of him, or trying to actually speed it up for him. So that's a big issue. We're talking about second overall pick, still dealing with that in year 3, but he's dealing with that and recovering simultaneously. So you're always going to have a setback in growth anytime they're focusing most of their effort on rehabbing. So I think he'll have the opportunity this summer. I don't think anything's going to happen now. I think everyone needs to understand with new ownership coming. Number one, I think he wasn't given the 5th-year option because I think Curl's going to get that money. I think Curl's just going to be like John Allen, Terry McLaurin. I think he's been patient. He's been cool. And just by him, really participating in position drills for the most part, there's a conversation, but they can't do anything to ownership changes, and saying that, I think you get to August. I think we're going to get a final word mid-August. I think that's the time. If there's any kind of potential trade or anything, that's what it will be. Because I really think that they're going to bring somebody in. I'm not saying they're going to fire Mayhew and these other guys, but I think they're going to bring in some kind of de facto GM, maybe just an observer early on. That could change in mid-season. They let go of Mayhew mid-season, but I really expect that to happen. So once they come, maybe evaluate Chase Young. I don't know if they're going to try him out in the preseason. I don't know if that's wise. If I'm them, I'm not really doing that. I think I want to see what he's doing in the scrimmage with Baltimore. I think you can get a lot out of that day to see what he looks like. But in the end, I've been saying this. I think Curl gets the deal, and it's going to be between Sweat and Young. And I think Sweat can get that contract if he gets 10 sacks, really good impact. But I think Young, we're talking about an all-pro year, because I think there's whispers he's not on the same page with Ron Rivera mentally, with a lot of things. So I think you have to see like a 15 sack plus season for him to be back. Because I personally, I think he'd have to have that plus taking more of a leadership role, because that C's coming off his chest. He's not going to be, on a captain this year. So again, that's just my guess. I don't say it's going to happen, but I think all those things coupled together, it's not really boding well for him being here next year. So I think if a team is going to give a real package for him, they're going to want to see a couple games. So I think it'll be closer to the trade deadline than, this summer.
And George, I mean, follow up on what Adam says. If somebody's still willing to trade for Young come the trade deadline, it's probably because he's having a good year. And then, so I guess to your original point, George, he's not more valuable to anybody than he is to this team right here. Because if he's playing well come the deadline, you would assume that the defense is playing well. And if the defense is playing well, you'd assume they'd be winning football games. So it's an interesting thing they've got themselves mixed up in. I thought it was interesting that Montez Sweat said in an interview the other day, Deron Payne showed us how to get the bag, right? Like if you play well, these guys here will reward you.
Right.
So let's go get that done. And I think that's interesting. It'll be an interesting dynamic as they change ownership, because that has been what they've done here since Ron Rivera came, is work your butt off, be a Commanders guy first, first in, first out kind of guy, last out type of deal, and we will pay you. And so far, they have ponied up when guys performed well. I guess the next step in the discussion, George, becomes, I think personally, Sweat's got a better chance of having that breakout year than Chase does. Do you?
I do. So Montez Sweat has been the more consistent player of the two, and he's been around. Like, if you kind of hear, keep your ear to the ground, kind of listen to all the beat reporters, they're talking about the team wants Montez Sweat. They keep talking about potentially giving him that long-term deal. So they are interested in him. He basically, he had 8 sacks last year, which he's on the brink. He had 8 sacks last year. He had a 9 sack.
The pressure rate is really high, right, George?
It is pretty high. So let me take a look. He had 28 QB hits last year, and I believe he had 31 QB pressures, which is pretty damn high as well. It actually led the team last year. Montez Sweat, man, when you see him just walking around, he is that physical specimen. He looks like he can take over a game. And, at 26 years old, I think he has a high upside potential. He had 46 tackles last year. He had 28 QB hits, like I mentioned before, and 14 tackles for loss. So he's on the brink. Like, someone said it actually recently. I mean, physical stature, they look different, but he's kind of like that Preston Smith. Like he's producing slowly, and he's a high floor guy. And Preston Smith still ascended when he went to the Packers afterwards. So I do think that Montez Sweat does have that upside. But I'm kind of curious how it's going to play out. Going back to Adam's point, like, that's an interesting dynamic, right? Like Chase Young, I do believe there is some friction between the coaching and him. I do think that Ron Rivera and him have a different vision on what they want in the future. I've actually heard some of that stuff like this through the grapevines, through people that I interact with. But the fact that the matter is that the players on the team, they do like Chase Young. I think he is that energetic, that fire starter player as well. So, I don't know. Like, I think there is a world where both of them could potentially return, but they really do got to produce. And I think having those two defensive ends, like, having a pass rush in this league is of the utmost importance. So they definitely got to keep at least one of them. So see how it plays out.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was I talk with G from the shop on Twitter all the time about various Commanders things. And he was bringing up that same point. Like, they could both have good years and both be back. And while it feels unlikely, I do think there's a world where they both ball out. They give Sweat a big contract this year and slap the franchise tag on Chase Young next year. And that, to me, is the perfect way for things to work out, simply because if I'm going to pay Chase Young, I'd like to see, even if he has a big year this year, I'd
I
like
like
to
that.
see it again.
I like that.
Like with Deron Payne, it felt like that big year was coming, right? And that he was slowly getting better every year. And so I don't think like I didn't need to see it again from him, even though it was kind of the first year where he had that big breakout season. With Chase, if he does it, that's great. I'd like to see it again because, you know, when and I get people love Chase Young, so they don't want to hear bad things about Chase Young. It's a very interesting thing. Maybe it's because he's from the area. But you go back to that rookie of the year for the defense, you know, his rookie of that defensive rookie of the year. I mean, go back and think about all the quarterbacks that he was hitting that year. I mean, it was the Ben DiNucci's of the world, right? Like it was
Right.
not, it was almost like a de facto defensive rookie of the year because there was really nobody else to
Yeah, you
give
nailed
it
it.
to.
That's a fair assessment. I
And
agree.
that's the other interesting thing, George, is you brought up their size. I was having this conversation on Twitter the other day. So I went and looked. I mean, they're basically, at least at the combine, the same guy, 6'5", 260. In fact, I think Chase Young was 5 pounds heavier when they got to the combine. The thing is, Chase didn't test. So
Mhm.
you don't have any of those numbers. I mean, people guessed at what the 40 would look like. It's interesting because maybe it's just because the production hasn't been there that I've just kind of let Chase slowly get out of my mind as far as what the potential was supposed to be. Because to me, you mentioned the higher floor, George. I still think that the ceiling might even be higher for Sweat if he could put it together. I think very interesting
Yeah, I want to
there
throw it over
with the
to
two guys.
I want to throw it over to Adam in a second. That's where I think you and I might disagree because I think Montez Sweat has the higher floor. He has produced. Like, we've seen it. He's consistent, which we like. We want consistency in our players. Chase Young was supposed to be that guy. I think that's like the dude, and I think that's why people are down on him, right? I think people want him to have that high upside. He was supposed to be better than the Bosa brothers coming out. He was supposed to be a 15 sack kind of guy, 16 sack kind of guy, taking over games kind of guy. Like honestly, like a Micah Parsons explosive impact player. And we're not seeing that from him. And I think that's where that critique is coming from. People are like, hang on and see where he goes with this. And some people are like, hey, he's a bust. He's never going to get back to that because of his knee. So like, that's the intriguing part for me. And Doug, I love what you said. Like, even if Chase Young does have an impactful year, maybe it is wise to kind of hit the franchise tag on him and not give him a large contract because we don't know where it's going to go from there. He should be consistently producing. He should be a game changer. We haven't seen that yet.
Adam, did he just get over-ranked? I mean, did he, like, we talked about that rookie of the year season, right? Was he at Ohio State beating up on poor left tackles in the Big Ten? I mean, was he over? You think he was just overvalued, or he just hadn't put it together in the league? Because he has not been George the Bosa's, to your point, George.
Well,
And I'm with you. I think that's what people thought.
he did have some bad tape, though. It wasn't all peaches and cream with him. That's why some were questioning. Should he go that early? Maybe a couple picks back. But I think it's part of the the need and the demand that he was available. I think Washington was just hoping he'll be the next great one. Personally, I like Young. I don't see it, though. I don't think he's going to be a premier top 5 pass rusher in the league. I think Sweat, he won't either, but I think he's right outside of that. I think you could see Sweat being in that top 10 conversation, 6, 7 ranked in time because he's consistent. I think you have to remember with Sweat, that year, the COVID year, then he broke his jaw. If that doesn't happen, I know we can say that with everything, but those are kind of freak things. That's not durability issues. You get those, I think it was 6, 7 games back. He was producing pressures, sacks. So I think if that happened, we wouldn't be having this conversation probably right now. Sweat would probably be in line to get a deal. Also, he was supposed to be a top 15 player. The misdiagnosed heart issue at the combine really made him slip. So I think, you're talking about Young and him. It's easy to compare Young being a top, number 2 overall pick and Sweat being that back round 1 guy. But in the end, I think if you're looking at, what are you trying to do philosophical with Del Rio, to me, would make sense. It's Sweat, because if you're having issues in year 3, injury or not, with, Young really getting on board with exactly what you want to do, you don't overpay him. You don't pay him top 5 money, and that's what he's looking at. Sweat, it'll be high. I think it'll be a little less than what it will be for Sweat for Young. But I think it just makes a lot more sense, going into next year, next draft. You have Curl locked up, you get Sweat knocked up. you go into that draft, it doesn't even have to be round 1, round 2. See what you have in KJ Henry this year. I don't think he's going to be a guy that's instantly, comes in starts, but I think, a combination of him and others, that might be something to explore. But I think because a lot of people I talked to at Clemson, I reached out to as many people as I could find in the SEC, and they're like, I'm telling you, this guy has just underperformed because, watching his tape, he was a 5-star prospect coming out of high school. He just really hasn't taken that next jump. Under Coach Z and Jack Del Rio, we could see, I definitely think one of these guys are going to, step up. And I think Henry, class act, perfect one to do it. So I think it's a foregone conclusion that we're going to see Young, playing 70-80% of the snaps this year. I think it could be definitely, a big split for at least half the year, because this is not just an ACL tear. This is a patella tendon. This takes a lot of time. I wrote an article comparing him and Clowney, with their injuries. And, although Clowney had microfracture surgery in his rookie year, these things linger for a couple years. So Young, in my opinion, he's in a bad spot right now to get a long-term, huge payday. I think, it makes the most sense if they can try to move him before the trade deadline. But like you said, if he's playing really well, you're not going to want to do it. If he's not playing that well, what are we talking about here? Because we'll get a third comp pick for him. Maybe a team says we'll give you a third and a conditional third next year based on playing time. So you have to weigh that. So for me right now, I think that Young is really going to have to do a lot to really endure himself to coaches, because again, it just keeps hearing, these whispers that they like his explosion. They like what he's seeing, but there's no talk of how he's progressing in the system. But I continually hear that with Sweat. So, take it for what you will.
Yeah, it's interesting, and we'll use that as a segue. Adam, you brought up KJ Henry, and we've talked about him on the show several times, because I'm with you. I think the talent level is there. As far as production, it's interesting. He's a lot like Montez Sweat. If I'm not mistaken, his pressure rate, KJ Henry, like top 5 in the nation last year, just didn't get home a lot. But here's the thing. I've got the depth chart up, and maybe this is the easiest way to get into it. I was thinking about, we were talking about KJ Henry. You said playing time. And when I talked to Ben Standard the other day, he brought up a great point. He was like, look at the depth chart and figure out how he gets on the field. Yeah. Because they like James Smith-Williams,
right?
Who I think is really good and a great run defender. I like Casey Toohill. Now, you said, Adam, maybe you weren't as high on Toohill, but I thought when given opportunities, he was productive last year. Yep. You got F.A. Obata, which we know the team likes. And then William Bradley King, I doubt makes the team.
Right.
But I mean, that's 3 guys right there ahead on the depth chart, not even including Chase Young.
I'd say you have to keep in mind they moved up to get KJ Henry. It's not, he didn't just fall in their lap. They thought enough of him to move up. So, we could talk about Shaka Tonys of the world and what's going on, but that was a late 7th-round pick. They moved up to get KJ Henry. So I do see a world where he beats out Toohill, because exactly, there's not going to be enough to go around. But I see him having a good camp, beating out Toohill, and, he'll be in the rotation. But primarily, I think, James Smith-Williams, he's the ideal depth guy. He's in his final year, just like every single of the defensive end. So they're going to keep their playmakers. But Toohill, I don't think that there's any threat to, cut him. He's going to go anywhere else. I think you can get him back just as easily. So I think that they'll, with Young, Henry, James Smith-Williams, I think you'll see, a little rotation with them. But I think you're going to see Montez Sweat with a lot more reps than Chase Young and the others. But I think with KJ Henry, the questions remain, how is he going to do against the run on the next level? Because I think there's definitely some questions there, because, he's got some nice pass rush move. He's got really a nice, sweet spin move, but it got him in trouble sometimes against the run when, they tried to block him low. So I think he's somebody you got to watch out for. But I think that in my world, that I just don't think Toohill's popping enough to really convince everyone. Again, Bradley King too, he's not going to make the team. And even, Andre Jones Jr., I think he makes the team because, like I said, I keep hearing over and over, outside linebacker. That's predominantly what he played at Louisiana. He did play defensive end, but that they have a vision. So, we talk about the linebackers, I think, that's a guy to look out there, although they'll list him at defensive end. But to me, it's a really interesting battle along that side for, behind Chase Young.
Did you see today, this is a little off topic, but it looks like Kaliki Hudson is playing middle linebacker.
Heard whispers about that a couple weeks ago. Yeah. They like him. They like him a lot, and they're going to give him the opportunity in preseason to call the signal. So that's something I'm really looking forward to seeing.
Yeah, because I was a huge fan of his when he came out of Michigan, and it felt like he was perfect for that. He played, they called it Viper at Michigan.
Right.
We call it the Buffalo nickel here. And he never got those snaps, and I was always surprised by that. And they worked him in a little bit at linebacker on the, I think it was weak side they had him at. I didn't think that he fit very well there. I was surprised. Interesting. And we've been talking about kind of how the linebacker position has evolved and at the middle linebacker. There's no more Ray Lewis middle linebackers. They've all got to be safety converts that can fly around the field. Will be interesting to see if that's where he ends up at. Because I did not see that one. I didn't have that on my bingo card, as they say. Let's get into the D tackles here on the line. It's interesting. It's wild how much play Ridgeway got last year. I'm assuming that the Cowboys are upset that they put him out there to be even, because I liked him coming out. I was surprised when they made that move. Arian Mathis comes back last year, and Adam, I really can't even believe I'm saying this. The two D tackles, Allen and Payne, average almost 90% of snaps during games. The fact that they didn't get hurt at that level, I remember talking to Chris Baker, and he was like, somebody's going to get hurt. Like you cannot play that percentage of the snaps. They did. You like Ridgeway or Mathis as that next guy in?
I like Mathis, but again, I need to see more because he's still recovering. But we have to remember he really had one good year at Alabama. Prior to his last season, it was very mediocre at best. But he had a really good supporting cast his last year and really got to the quarterback. That's something he does. So he's not just an occupier up front. He's a guy that can get to the quarterback. I would like to see him worked in more. I temper expectations, even though his injury happened really early last year. And then Ridgeway, I'm hearing I think it was a bicep or something he's dealing with right now. So, that's something can linger. So, watch for that going in. But I don't know, to be honest with you, the depth behind those two, I want to see them playing closer to, 70-something% of the snaps. So I'm hoping they're not done. I'm hoping they're still going to look at maybe an offensive tackle, maybe another defensive tackle, just even to bring in like a veteran. Because, we see every year, late in the summertime, they usually bring in a veteran, somebody to really shake things up. I'm hoping to see that because I don't know. I'm not really sold at the depth right now because if you have Allen or Payne go down for, even a couple games, that could be a real big issue for them.
It looks like pictures from camp that Fedarian has slimmed down a little bit. And we had expected that he would be like the replacement run stuffer in the middle. But maybe the defense, maybe that's not what they're looking for in D tackles anymore, right, George. Maybe they're also like as everything gets faster and more nimble, maybe this idea of the old 320-pound nose is not what they want anymore, and they're going to keep getting a little smaller at the D tackle position, sending them at the quarterback. Where do you think that lines up?
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting because we saw that Daron Payne's kind of losing weight as well, and we saw the philosophy change over time as well, right? Like over the past couple of years, I think maybe Jack Del Rio's first year, and definitely going back to the Gruden days, they played a two-gap system before, where they basically had these big monster defensive tackles that would basically, just try to just absorb the offensive linemen, so the linebackers could get upfield and basically make the tackle. But over the past couple of years, they moved to a one gap system where, like, the philosophy is, you basically make the tackle on the way to the quarterback. That's kind of the philosophy moving forward. So, Daron Payne, he definitely thrived as opposed to being a more of a zero tech to more getting upfield, and got 11.5 sacks last year. So we're starting to see that development. And I love the depth. I know that maybe me and Adam disagree there. I like the fact that Ridgeway's, is another defensive tackle in the mix, and we have Phil Mathis as well. Mathis, we haven't seen him actually play yet, so we do want to see some more impact there. But you got to trust those. I have high respect for Alabama defensive linemen. Maybe it's the bias with Payne and Allen over there, but I think there is some depth there, and I think it'll be interesting to see. We talked about it in our group chat. I'm kind of confident in our defensive line depth as well as our defensive back depth. I think linebacker is still something that I'm concerned about. So I'm curious who's like, for me, what I'll be watching in training camp and preseason is definitely who's going to be getting more of that front end, high end rotation. Is it going to be Mathis or is it going to be Ridgeway?
Yeah.
And I love the whole Henry conversation as well, because I think there's higher upside with there. Like, we know Obata is a pretty steady player there. Tuel's pretty steady player there, but what are we really trying to do? We're trying to build a program that's sustainable, right? Obata's 30 years old. We don't want him to be our starting. He's on a 1-year contract anyway. So we want to see KJ Henry have some impact there. So I think they're trying to generate chaos and have our defensive backs create some turnovers. What they're trying to do.
I'm looking here at the defensive tackle list. It's John Ridgeway, Benning Patel, Deron Payne, Fedarian Mathis, David Bada, Jonathan Allen, and Abdullah Anderson. To your point earlier, Adam, there is not, after those two guys that we talked about, those 4 D tackles, there's not much behind.
Right. And, like George made the perfect point. I think we're going to see them mix it up. Like a lot of those 5-man fronts, I think, can, involve extra defensive ends, not necessarily defensive tackles like they did in the past. So it's not a huge concern. But again, they got some more money. I know Curl is probably going to get a deal, but I'd like to see some of these veterans brought in. I'm a big proponent of bringing in veteran journeymen, because I think that they can make a big impact sometime at camp, even if they don't make the team at the end. Sometimes they're enough to push guys like Mathis and Ridgeway, because that's what I want to see. Because you're talking about behind them, nobody's pushing behind them, and I'd be surprised if you're talking about them playing like 30-40% of the snaps and taking some of the heat off of Allen and Payne. But in the preseason, they're going to get a chance to play a lot. So to me, and I'll reserve my absolute judgment, because that's what I want to see. I want to see Mathis be anchoring in the preseason. So, but in the end, I think that Del Rio, I've seen this morph of philosophy, which I called him a dinosaur forever, but I'm seeing this morph of philosophy. We'll talk about the defensive backs, later on this month, but that's what has me excited, because I think what they're able to do with all these defensive backs, Percy Butler is really standing out in camp along with the rookies. So I think that's going to allow them a lot more freedom, maybe to get, more athleticism up front. Like, again, we talked about KJ Henry. I think that they have a plan to get him in a lot on passing situations, because I think that that's, maybe taking, an Allen or Payne off certain situations, which is crazy to think, but, that might be an opportunity for them to mix it up. So I think that they'll have a lot of leeway. Defensive tackle won't be huge, but I always like to see, more competition brought in.
I'd like to see some more competition brought in too, to your point, Adam. And there are a lot of good D tackles and DNs still out there on the market. I saw the Bills just signed Leonard Floyd the other day for a 1-year deal, and I kind of liked what that makes them look like as far as being able to be flexible. If they play more, and they did a bunch of this actually last year with the 5-man defensive front, who plays linebacker then? Jamin stays on every down. So you do like a 5-1-5. Is that Jamin stays?
Yeah, I think
I'd say so.
Yeah, they like that kid with Seattle. One thing about Barton is his name, right? Yeah, that's the one thing they liked about him. If you look towards the end of the year when he got more of the Mike duties, they had him rushing the passer. So granted, he had some good reps in coverage. He actually, I think it was 3.5 sacks or 3 sacks. He actually looked good. So I think having him in that kind of situation, allowing him to use his length, because if anything, you're not just talking about sacks. Like the dude's like 6'3" plus. Getting his long arms up. I think that's another reason they love Forbes, because I think we're going to see a record amount of tip balls from this defense this year. I think that's something that all of these guys can do across the board, and they'll be able to have some leeway like that. And
that defensive front there on the line, they get a lot of tip balls too.
A lot.
They did last year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. A lot. They'll be able to mix it up. Like we talked about, I'm not sure if the kid from Louisiana, the 7th round, is going to see much play this year. But again, he was 6 years at Louisiana. He really, paid his bones. And the last 2 years, he looked like a guy that is exciting in a rushing outside. A lot of length, 6'6", good speed, good bend. So I think that Del Rio wants to find ways to get a lot of these guys in. I don't think he wants to have his defensive tackles playing, 90% of the snaps. I think he wants to feel comfortable. But again, I think after they lost Ioannidis and
Settle.
It was a big drop off. Mathis is still a work in progress, and Ridgeway was a pleasant surprise. So they still have a long way to go there.
Is this the best position group on the team, George?
Mm. Are we talking collectively with the defense ends as well with Sweat and Young?
Yeah, we'll do ends and tackles together, the defensive line.
Yeah, I'd say so because I think we were talking about it offline. I think like the true studs on the team, right, are Terry McLaurin, Jonathan Allen, and Deron Payne. Those are the true tier one players on our team. So if two of our four starters are some of our best players on our team, I would argue that. I think the next position would probably be wide receiver group. I'm really high on them as well, and I think our safeties.
Yeah.
Our safeties are it's funny. I want to see how they can continue and have that consistency, but like they have high upside. Like I'm a big Derek Forrest guy. I like him a lot. Cameron Curl's a pretty solid player as well, as we know. I'm really starting to see how Percy Butler develops. So that's going to be intriguing. But right now on day one, our consistency, as they should be, a lot of first round picks are there. A lot of money's invested in our first round picks on the defensive line. So I think they are.
You think the same thing, Adam? That's the best position group on the team?
Yeah, well, Payne, Allen, Sweat probably trump every other position, collectively. But again, I really like the DBs. You talked about the safeties. Quan Martin, he's a nickel and he's a safety. He's going to see significant time there. So the DB group is probably the deepest, in my opinion, that it's been in years, and that's including the safeties. But overall talent, it's not even a question. It's the defensive line right now.
And the depth, it's interesting as we do these. And that's kind of why we do these. Is I guess I thought that we had better depth at defensive tackle. I am now intrigued as we go through this exercise that I really thought that it was the depth at defensive tackle, and it's not. It's probably more depth at the end position.
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I agree with that, actually. It's a good point because we do have KJ Henry and Casey Toohill there. The Phil Mathis, Ridgeway depth is pretty solid, but you're right. If one of those go down and we're starting to see those other guys come in, we haven't even seen them play before, so it is definitely a concern.
But you have Henry and Tony. Those are the only two defensive ends under contract next year. So that's true. That's going to be a big consideration. Like Tony, I'm a little surprised they haven't cut him. I don't know how the rules work with this kind of suspension, but I'm surprised that they don't, because I don't see a spot for him now. I think Henry kind of came in and took that right away, probably more some. So I think that your defensive tackle depth is decent right now, but the defensive end, this time next year, it's going to look way different. So that's why I'm saying I hope they're not done yet, because there is guys still in the market, because again, we're putting a lot of stock that, Chase Young is going to be able to give them significant snaps and, eclipse that 60% range. And again, I'll wait and see kind of thing right now.
Would you be interested in trading Young for, say, the second if it got offered? It makes more sense to trade Young for a second and then sign a guy like Ngakoue who's still out on the open market. I think that might be an interesting way to go. I don't think it will happen. Right. I think a lot of that's probably more about ownership stuff than it is anything else, because you're talking about major decisions in a former number 2 overall pick. But there's a couple of guys on that Ngakoue level that could be had on a 1-year deal that probably don't cost you a ton, and then maybe you can still get your value out of Chase Young.
Right. Yeah, Harris is that's the thing. I do expect him to come in, and I don't think it'll be a slow process. I think right away he's going to want to make his mark immediately this year. So I think that he's shown, at least with the 76ers. I don't follow the Devils too much, but I did see from day one when he bought the 76ers, he was always trying to make moves. He wasn't scared to anytime there was overpaid guys, he'd move them. So I don't think Young is not somebody he selected. So I don't think as granted he's a number 2 overall pick, but somehow if you can get a high offer and then parlay that into next year, because also the thought's going to be down the road, if Howell doesn't work out, you want to have as many of those early day 2 picks as possible to be able to hopefully get some ammunition to move up one of these quarterbacks, because it's not just Caleb Williams. There is 3 or 4 top level quarterbacks that are going to be available in the top 10 in this draft. And as we keep seeing, Washington, even a down year for them, they're still in that 15-16 range when draft time comes. So it's going to be a move for the future. Like, how much do they think he can impact? Maybe if Henry just starts really looking really good in preseason, I think I could see a scenario where ownership comes in and, they might be comfortable with moving him. But I think there's just not enough tape on Young showing that he's progressed for a team willing to. It's a 1-year rental at this point. Give anything significant. So I think who you see is who, for the most part, you're gonna get.
And to that point, to kind of back it up, I have a really good friend who's a diehard New Jersey Devils fan. We talked about it before. They completely liquidated the New Jersey Devils. When they took over the team, they basically sent away all the high draft, all the veterans that had high contracts and were fan favorites and things of that nature, and completely let them go for future draft capital. Right. And I think for like 5 years in a row or something absurd like that, they had multiple first round picks to rebuild the team. They even had like a top 2 pick, top 3, maybe the number 1 overall pick altogether, who's now the face of the franchise. Right. He's the face of the NHL, so he's a stud attacker on the New Jersey Devils now. So that is intriguing to me. I do think that there's no attachment. There's no emotional attachment to anybody on the team. I think he wants to get the team, with Harris coming over, and I think he will be financially sound with the way he builds the team. So you never know. For me, I guess there is an emotional attachment to Chase Young because I do want to see it through. I want to see how he goes. But honestly, you're right, though, Doug. If you get a second-round pick and you get a comparable veteran to come in and kind of play for a third of the price, that is forward thinking, right? It's kind of a smarter method. So maybe that does happen. I don't know.
Well, it also keeps you from having to make tough decisions.
Yeah.
Right. Because if you give Montez Sweat a big contract, if he balls out, if he pulls a pain, and you're at $22-23 million a year probably is what a guy that's getting getting double-digit sacks. And the tag, I think, is 20. So, again, I know the numbers can work, but to pay 4 guys on the defensive line around $20 million is really not where you want to be at, even if you're not having to pay the rest of the defense a ton of money, just purely in the way, philosophically, the way you build teams. I don't mind the idea that your best defensive linemen are now interior linemen, because I kind of feel like that's where the league has moved a little bit. Like, let's get these faster, quicker guys in the middle and beat up on centers and guards that may not be, as physically gifted as the tackles, which I think you're going to see guards getting better and more nimble and more athletic as we talk about the defensive tackles doing. So the one thing about trading Young now is it alleviates making a decision that would be tough a year from now. Imagine if Chase Young had a great year and you just move on from him and the fan base goes crazy. Right, Adam? So I think that's George, I think that's another way of kind of looking forward on this thing.
For sure.
Is alleviating crazy decisions now.
Let me throw a question out because I'm kind of getting the vibe from Adam. I guess, Doug, I'll throw it to you. Maybe Adam can jump on it as well. On a scale from 1 to 10, like what is your thought on basically Chase Young having a breakout year? Do you think he's going to bounce back? Like, what's your confidence level on that? Doug, I guess start with you.
Oh, a 5.
Okay. Okay.
Pretty close.
I don't. Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, I'm at it like at a 6 myself because again, this is still a significant injury, and I think spending all the time he's still rehabbing, still dealing with that, and again, I think with Payne and Sweat, the difference I've seen is their off-season work on their counters. It's night and day from what we saw from their first 2 years. And Young, like I said, I just don't know if he's open enough to that. Everything I keep hearing, he loves that stutter step move. He loves what got him here. So, that's the kind of thing that stops great players from really, ascending from a great player in college to great in the NFL. So, again, even injury aside, I'm just not sure that I see him having that kind of year. I think Sweat's going to have the breakout year because I just like how he carries himself. I think he's bought into it. That's what it comes down to. He's bought into it. I don't think Chase Young has bought into it.
And to that point, I've heard that Montez Sweat actually plays, like him and Jonathan Allen have a good dynamic on the field. They've talked about how they work well off each other. So I do see that. Let me throw one more question out there, Doug, if you don't mind. Who do you
real quick before you do, George, what's your comfort level?
I'm at the same ballpark as you. I think I'm a little bit higher. I think maybe like 6.5. I think I think that was gonna be my follow-up question. I think Chase Young is probably gonna get to like 8.5, 9 sacks. He's gonna have a decent solid year. I don't think he's gonna be that. I don't think he's ever gonna be 15 sack kind of guy. I think maybe when he hits, it's gonna be maybe a 12 sack kind of year, something like of that nature. I could expect 8 or 9 this year. And I was gonna ask you guys, do you think that is good enough? Like, would you potentially re-sign Chase Young if he had an 8 or 9 sack year? Would that not be that wouldn't be good enough for you? How do you guys feel about that?
Well, here's the other thing. If we're talking about Montez Sweat having a breakout year, let's say that's 11 or 12 sacks.
Okay.
And Jonathan Allen is good for his 8 or 9, and Deron Payne is good for 10 or 11 again. Like, where are the sacks for Chase Young?
Right.
That's the only problem with having 4 quote unquote great defensive linemen that are all trying to get to the quarterback. Is that, I mean, there's only so many dropbacks and sacks available. I think that also works against Chase Young as far as getting to that number that he'd need to get to get paid. Now, maybe it's him and not Sweat.
Right.
But I don't think there's a world in which both ends are getting 10, 11, 12 sacks simply because I just don't see where they come from. Because there's going to be other guys out there. He'll be on the sideline some of the times when you're rushing the passer. Jamin Davis will get a couple of sacks. Casey Toohill, I think, was good for 4 sacks last year. So, like, that's my thing. Not his talent level is not what I expected it to be when he was drafted 2nd overall. And I just wonder where the production will come from.
I think it has to be impact plays. I know, like, we talk about sacks, especially when we talk about defensive ends, but I think in the modern NFL, exactly, we're seeing a lot more focus on the defensive tackles. And I think a lot of defensive ends, they're getting, I don't know about phased out, but the thought is, more replaceable. For him to separate, like you said, 9, 10 sacks, it's not enough. For Sweat, I think it is, because he has impact all over the field. That speed, Young just doesn't have that speed. We're talking about on run plays, Sweat chasing down people from behind. Yeah. Young has to have those plays. We have to talk, 5, 6 forced fumbles. Impact game plays. To me, that's the only, it's that or 15 sack plus year, like just domination. Yeah. Sweat doesn't have to have that season because I think he's been consistent. Young does, because Young hasn't been consistent. So, in that rookie year, you could really argue that, a lot of good plays, his teammates put him in good position. A lot of the plays were forced his way. So, I think when Harris comes in, it's pretty easy. There's not a ton of film to really break down with Young. But then when you look at Sweat, just the consistency, that's what you like to, pay guys in. And, we talk about Curl consistency. When he's not playing, this team is nowhere as good. I think it was a difference of 1-5 to 6-1 when Curl wasn't with the team. So it's about impact. And right now, Young hasn't shown that he can be that guy. And I honestly, personally, in this system, I don't think that's what they're looking for. I think he fits probably a different kind of mold. I think they're trying to get faster. They're trying to get quicker. And that's not what Young is.
He could be. The explosion wasn't there last year. Now, maybe I think the injury was worse than people thought it was and gave it credit for. So apparently the explosion is a little bit more noticeable in camp this year. George, does it bother you that he still got a brace on the knee?
Not during training camp. If we're just kind of getting the reps right now and just getting the practice during the summertime, I don't see it as an issue. And honestly, nowadays with NFL technology and, with honestly just technology and medical things all together, that brace is probably featherweight, carbon fiber, pretty light on him anyway. It's not even a big a deal. So if he feels that he needs that extra protection, I'm not too worried about it right now.
Adam, is Sweat a better run defender? Because in my mind, he is.
Yeah. Like I said, that's what the difference that separates them. He's all over the field. He's chasing guys from behind. He's sealing the edge. Young he's not showing a propensity to do that. Montez Sweat he's a guy, exactly. He doesn't have to come off the field. You can even move him inside. That's something he did at Mississippi State, routinely was go inside. He has the size for it and the strength for it. He's got even stronger. It would be hard for it not to work out with Young, But for me, for Sweat, I had him highly ranked. I evaluated him coming out. I think that you don't let him leave. I think he's, like you talk about the chemistry that he has with the Alabama brothers. I think that can't be understated, because you haven't heard that talk at all with Chase Young. You just haven't heard about those connections, and I think that's what they're trying to instill. And Coach Z, he's been one of the big difference makers in that. So either Young buys in and balls out, or he doesn't. And I just think it's like he's trying to catch up to chemistry as well. That's another thing. Like, he doesn't have the chemistry that these other guys have, and then you're gonna be able to notice that on the field.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought that up, Adam, and that's the second time you said that, kind of the chemistry that Sweat and John Allen have. And it's, if I recall right, Chase Young started off on that side, and then they moved him. And I wonder if and he was better over there, right? But I wonder if Allen didn't say, I prefer playing with Sweat over here, because it would feel like, and people clamored for it at the end of last year when Young came back, switch him back over. They didn't do that. And now maybe that's why.
Yeah. Sweat has that bent. He has that bent to take on the blind side guys. And Young right now, he's still working that same move. So he's got to come out with a new trick to go on that side. But right now, Allen, I wouldn't see him really going to coach or say anything. I just think it's probably evident. It's probably evident right away when they watch the film, see him in practice, hear the communication. And I think, and again, just whispers, that's the big thing I'm hearing. There's not the talking. Young is a big time talker, but I'm hearing there's not as much communication going on with him and the rest of the line as there is with Allen, Payne, and Sweat. That's noticeable, and that's the stuff that that they're going to notice in camp.
Well, we spent a lot of time kind of being hard on Chase Young. Unfortunately, that's the name of the business when you don't perform up to expectation, particularly when they're that high. But I think it's important to also state the team is in a much better place if Chase Young is the number 2 overall prospect that we thought he was. So I think it's important for all of those watching, like, we want Chase Young to be every bit the 15 sack artist that we hoped he'd be when he drafted. It's also important to remember he just hadn't done it.
Right.
He hasn't done it at all since he's been here. Frankly, last year was still getting over their injury because he didn't even look the same, as the guy they drafted. So I think it's important to remember that while we're critical of Chase Young, we all understand the team is better when he's better.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the biggest thing going into camp is let's hope the explosion is back. And hey, if he gets to 15 sacks and makes a tough decision for the coaching staff and the new owner, that would be fantastic.
Awesome. Great problem to have, 100%.
Yeah, exactly.
It would be a great problem to have. Okay, well, I think we got through that pretty well for the first time doing one of these positional group breakdowns. Next week, we'll do the secondary. So come back and see what we think about that. Fellas, we'll see you next Monday. Thanks.
Take it easy, guys. All right, guys, take it easy. I got to run.
All right, fellas.